Hi, welcome. Good morning in parts of the world, good afternoon in other parts of the world. My name is George Perkovich. I'm a vice president for studies here at the Carnegie Endowment, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this book chat, let's call it, with Nicole Perroth, who is the author of this book. This is How They Tell Me the World Ends, which is now a bestseller, and deservedly so. The book is a really good read. It's not work. Some of us do this stuff for work, but I found that it was a enjoyable, not enjoyable, I would say, but enticing read on the weekend. There are a lot of stories and characters in it, and it also really addresses some pretty profoundly important public policy issues and quandaries. So you get a combination of a good read and an exploration of serious issues which are quite current today. What we're going to do this morning is I'm going to ask Nicole to kind of give you a brief tour of the book. Then I'm going to ask her a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to discussion. And again, thank you all for joining us. Nicole, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, George, and thank you to the Carnegie Endowment for doing this. It's a real treat. One of my favorite events was also hosted by the Carnegie Endowment a few years ago with Tim Maurer, who is now at the Department of Homeland Security. So it's exciting to know someone who's handling some of these issues in government now. And I apologize to everyone. It's still early here in California, and about 5 minutes ago, I was singing Twinkle Twinkle to my 2-year-old on demand. So still, the coffee is still kicking in. So I cover cybersecurity at the New York Times. I have for a decade now. And the attacks kept getting worse. When I started back in 2010, the biggest threat that we faced, it looked like, was Anonymous, which was this loose hacking collective that was flooding websites with traffic. Usually it was just whoever they could take down. Sometimes it was the website for the CIA. And these days that looks pretty quaint. Every year the attacks got worse. It was Chinese intellectual property. Then it was attacks that decimated data at Saudi Aramco and the Sands Casino from Iran. Then it was the Russian hacks of the grid, and then the election. And then just recently, we're looking at someone, we don't even know who they are. They could be a teenager, they could be a disgruntled Patriots fan, hacking water treatment facilities in Florida and upping the amount of chemical in the water. And of course, SolarWinds, the attack that has basically upended our federal IT networks. So I had been covering these attacks nonstop, and I didn't even really have the time to sit back and process what I was doing because it was this 24/7 beat and it was turning into a real beast. And one thing I just wanted to dig into more that I could not in my day job was the incentive structures around these attacks. So, specifically the incentive structures around adding to our own vulnerability. And Silicon Valley, the biggest philosophy for getting a product to market wasn't security, it was move fast and break things, famously espoused by Mark Zuckerberg. And for individuals, for the last 10 years, we have just been hooking up our phones to anything we can, hooking up our critical infrastructure. We wanted convenience, access, speed, and speed has always been the natural enemy of security. So over the last decade, we've really made ourselves more vulnerable. But the piece of this that fascinated me, because it had created such a moral hazard in my mind, was government's approach to cybersecurity. Government has talked, every administration has talked a lot about the need for cybersecurity back to Obama, the early years of Obama, when Obama and McCain's campaigns were hacked. But I also knew that behind the scenes, I had heard these murmurings of a government-backed market that would pay hackers not to help lock up our systems necessarily, but to actually keep us more vulnerable. That they were paying hackers either through intermediaries like brokers or directly for vulnerabilities in code in Microsoft Windows, your iPhone software, Android software, and that they would ask hackers to turn over the code to exploit these vulnerabilities for espionage, or in some cases, battlefield preparations, and never tell a soul. And to me, this became the biggest market that no one had ever heard of. And I really wanted to dig into this moral hazard because 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago, we were all using different software. Russia used Huawei, we used Cisco. China used Huawei, we used Cisco. Russia used its own software and hardware. But now we all use the same software and hardware. We all use iPhones and Android phones, and whether you know it or not, you use Microsoft Windows. So I was fascinated by this dilemma between, when does the government decide that it wants to keep a certain piece of software vulnerable so that it can use it to spy on terrorists, spy on our adversaries, or even plant a cyber weapon in their grid one day? And when does it decide, no, this is going to keep Americans vulnerable? We should really patch this and turn it over to Microsoft, Apple, Google, et cetera. And so I set off to sort of infiltrate this market. Now, I come at this from a complete outsider perspective. When I started at the Times 10 years ago, I knew nothing about cybersecurity. In fact, I told the people who interviewed me at the Times that I knew nothing about cybersecurity and that there were other cybersecurity reporters I knew who were far more qualified. And what they said was, we've interviewed those people and we had no idea what they were talking about. You're hired. And that to me actually was a pretty important data point because there has been a huge communication lapse between the people who know about this market, who know about our vulnerabilities, who know how they're being exploited by governments, and everyday Americans. And what I wanted to do with this book was write a book that was readable and that would keep your attention, but also relinquish some control from some of these discussions inside government and inside the information security community to everyday people so that we would all understand what the stakes were for some of these decisions that were being made on our behalf. So I set out to infiltrate this market. Now, this is a market that no one talks about because, first of all, they're dealing with code that is essentially, if I, a hacker, find a way to exploit your iPhone vulnerability in your iOS software, and I know how to develop the program to exploit it. I can sell that to a government or a government broker for $2.5 to $3 million these days. But I also have to agree not to tell Apple about it, not to tell anyone about it. And I'm usually locked up in NDA, or increasingly, some of these deals are classified. And once that code becomes known to Apple or to a security researcher, it will get fixed and patched and rolled into your software updates, and you'll patch it, and it inherently loses its value for government spies and brokers. So I knew this was one thing no one wanted to talk about. There had been a story actually in Forbes magazine when I worked there more than 10 years ago of a zero-day broker named the Gruck. He's on Twitter. He has 100,000 followers, who talked to Forbes about this market. And he actually even posed for a photo next to a giant duffel bag of cash and talked about the fact that he was selling these 0 days to governments. And what I learned was that after that publication, government stopped doing business with him because no one wanted to do business with anyone who talked about this publicly. So I had my work cut out for me because no one wanted to discuss this secret market for secret code to a New York Times reporter. So for the last 10 decades, I sort of peeled back what was already public to find out what was not public. And I was able to track down one of the original zero-day brokers. I was able to find the guy that's known in intelligence circles, at least, as the godfather of American cyber war, who helped spearhead some of these programs, and find out the history of some of these programs, which I learned dated all the way back to the 80s, or actually even the late 70s, when we discovered a exploit on our typewriters at the US Embassy in Moscow. And that exploit, which was sitting in the back of a coil of a typewriter, was the most sophisticated thing we had ever seen. It was a tiny magnetometer that measured the slightest disturbance in the Earth's magnetic field. And next to it was a tiny electronic unit who cataloged those disturbances from each typewritten stroke and sent them via radio to a radio unit that was buried in the embassy's chimney. And that really opened the NSA's eyes to the fact that unless we were exploiting anything with a digital pulse, unless we could catch up to the Soviets, we were going to lose the Cold War. And so for the next 2, 3 decades, that is exactly what we have done. Anytime a new technology has come on the market, we have found ways to exploit it, to capture communications. But also, as a lot of the software has been rolled into our power plants, our nuclear plants, our water treatment facilities, our trains and planes and air traffic control, we've also known that these exploits have great potential for battlefield preparations. And so we've been stockpiling these are called zero-day exploits and vulnerabilities, in some of the code that makes its way into our critical infrastructure. Now, increasingly over the last few years, we've seen those attacks here in the United States. We caught an Iranian hacker mucking around with the controls at one of our dams and potentially could have unleashed the locks on that dam. It turns out they were in the wrong dam. They were in the Bowman Avenue Dam in Westchester County, New York, which holds back a tiny babbling brook. But there was another Bowman Dam that we thought they were in originally in Oregon that held back a tsunami's worth of water. And in the book, I actually describe Michael Daniel, who was then the White House cybersecurity coordinator, getting a call from John Brennan, who's a pretty measured guy, screaming that Iran was in the Bowman Dam in Oregon. And fortunately, they were not. But we've had a lot of these close calls. And, most recently with this attack on the water treatment facility in Florida. So, infiltrating this world, and one of the things George and I talked about is hard enough for someone who is an outsider. It's also a little difficult for someone who is a woman. Um, this is a really male-dominated world for the most part, although we are seeing a lot of women leaders now, with Ann Neuberger becoming a deputy secretary for national security secretary for cyber, and so, infiltrating this was hard enough. And I went into it really thinking, okay, there's no rules around this thing. The US government buys this code from hackers. Sometimes these brokers buy this from teenagers in Israel and for a long time in Eastern Europe. We were really, in my mind, leaving it to a lot of people's own moral compass to decide who they would and would not sell this code to. And a lot of the hackers I met and now commercial entities that develop these vulnerabilities into zero-day exploits and sell them to governments will only sell them to Western countries, the United States and our partners in Five Eyes, the 5 English-speaking nations that form our closest intelligence agencies. But I learned that this market had spread a long time ago to places like Argentina. So I went down to an Argentine hacking conference where I was, I think, the only woman there. And I went out with Ivan Arce, who's one of the godfathers of the hacking scene there. And he really explained to me that a couple of decades ago, because Argentina has these strict import-export controls, they don't have the same toys and apps that we had here. They didn't have Amazon Prime. They didn't even have iPhones. There were huge restrictions on the import of iPhones. So if you had one, you smuggled it in or you paid exorbitant prices for it. So to access all the apps and services that we take for granted here, they had to hack to get those same toys and tools. And that had created a large hacking culture in Argentina. And for a while, some of the biggest penetration testers, those are the companies that will test exploits against your systems to see where you might be vulnerable, were coming from Argentina. And they contracted out to places like NASA and Wall Street banks and some government agencies, and they would test these exploits against your systems to find out if you're vulnerable. So they were finding these vulnerabilities and exploiting them for defensive purposes. But what he explained was that there is a new generation of hackers in Argentina right now who found that they can sell the same code to governments and make a lot of money. Like I said, $2.5 to $3 million is the going rate for an exploit that could get me into your iPhone and read your text messages and turn on your audio without you knowing. And it's not taxed, and they can get paid in dollars, which go a long way in Buenos Aires, and you can live large. And so this new generation of hackers had really become the new supply market. They called it the India of exploit development when I was down there. So I asked Yvonne, so will they only sell to these good Western governments? And he laughed in my face and said, Nicole, good Western governments, the last time I checked, the country that bombed another country into oblivion wasn't Iran or China, it was the United States. And by the way, the United States had facilitated Argentina's dirty wars. So if anything, if they were just going to trust their own moral compass in Argentina, they would prefer to sell some of these exploits to China than the United States. And that really opened my eyes to the fact that this market has spread so far beyond Western control. In the beginning, it was really the United States and some of our European allies who were sponsoring this market. But now the cat is out of the bag, and every government on earth, with maybe the exception of Antarctica and a handful of others, are stockpiling these zero-day exploits, both for espionage, but a lot of cases I learned that these aren't the United States and Five Eyes. These are countries, even allies like Turkey and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, who will use these tools to spy on journalists, their Twitter critics, dissidents, and in some cases use them to torture their own people. And I met with one of the targets of a UAE spy program, and he is now in solitary confinement and has been for some time because they were upset about some of the things he was advocating in terms of um, allowing people to vote and criticizing the monarchy on Twitter. But also, this market has also closed the capabilities gap in some ways. The United States is still the most advanced cyber superpower in the world. Have been a handful of others like Israel and Russia who are also at the top of the heap. But for a long time, there was a big gap between us and the Irans and North Koreas of the world who had the intent to use cyber for destructive purposes but didn't have the capabilities. And you could argue that that capabilities gap has sufficiently closed. They don't have the same cyber weapon development capabilities as we do here. We haven't seen them pull off the equivalent of what the US and Israel pulled off on an Iranian nuclear facility when we dismantled some of their centrifuges. But they have learned that with just a rudimentary wiping malware, they can do a lot of damage. And we've seen them probing our critical infrastructure perhaps more aggressively and frequently than any other nation state these days. So all of this is in the book, and I think that's my primer, George. Sorry if I rambled a little too long.
No, that was great. It was a great overview. Um, I want to, before I ask you about a couple of the kind of policy dilemmas that you raise in the book raise, I wanted to take you back a little bit to Argentina because one of my favorite scenes in the book actually is it's just a little vignette. It's maybe a page where you are at that conference that you mentioned just now, and you turn down an invitation from a bunch of these guys to go to dinner, and you decide uh, to go out yourself. Read just a line from it, which I quite like. You tucked my laptop in the hotel safe, slipped on a dress, squeezed my sore feet into heels, and hailed a cab across town to the old Puerto Madero harbor. And then you kind of describe an evening and reflect on what someone had told you about being a woman in this field. Tell us a little bit about that, and also the end of the story. What happens when you go back? Because I think it gives a real flavor for being a journalist in this field.
Well, so I treated myself to dinner, and I forget Cabana de las Lilas. I think that was the name of the restaurant. If you ever go to Buenos Aires, you have to go because it was one of the best meals of my life. So I took myself out to dinner. It had been days that I'd been at the conference, and I suddenly realized it was I hadn't seen a woman in almost a week. And I was walking around Argentina and I was thinking about that dynamic and thinking about the fact that there weren't enough women in this space and that, women had triggered wars before, maybe they could help solve them. And that moment in the book was just me sort of processing everything that I was learning in Argentina from a lot of these conversations with Ivan Arce and others. And I headed back to my hotel, and that same safe with my laptop was open, and the door was open, but all the cash I'd pulled out from the cueva was still sitting on my desk, and my laptop had been moved into a different position. So I knew someone had either tried to get it in it or had tampered with it. Fortunately, it was a burner loaner laptop from the New York Times that I hadn't touched, but I knew to be so skeptical about some of these tampering methods that I wrapped it in the plastic garbage bag from the bathroom, took it downstairs, and just threw it in the threw it in the lobby garbage bag because I knew that was the only way I was going to be able to get whoever was in that laptop off of it.
Thanks. I had never thought about what it would be like trying to cover these issues, but this gave me a nice feel for it. That it'd be difficult not to become perhaps paranoid or else realistic about these things. Let me turn to one of what I think are is one of the kind of major issues that comes out of the book, and you treat Stuxnet as kind of a watershed event. That's, as you mentioned, the U.S.-Israeli basically attack on the centrifuge program at Natanz in Iran. And to mix metaphors from a watershed, also a boomerang that it kind of came back. And there's a lot of technical debate about whether that in fact was true, that the code that was used in Stuxnet actually was used in attacks by Iran on Saudi Arabia and so on. But what I want to talk about is are a couple of things. I mean, one is, as you alluded to in your presentation, wasn't it inevitable that somebody would use code basically to do an attack that broke stuff? Mm-hmm. This attack broke Iran's centrifuges, and so it was sabotage, basically, but with physical effects. It wasn't just espionage. They broke stuff. And so one of the questions is, if it was the first such one, wasn't it inevitable? So the idea of a bad precedent doesn't really apply. And then I think more intriguingly is the idea of whether there should be norms or kind of a code amongst thieves, as it were, or breakers in this case, about the right way to do it. Because Stuxnet actually was brilliantly designed and didn't cause damage outside of the specific environment of an enrichment plant. So that while the code did escape, it wasn't planned to, but it escaped and it got out around the world. It didn't do damage anyplace else. And so I guess the broader question or dilemma is, isn't it better to destroy things by cyber means than by cruise missiles or bombs or people putting explosives in them? And so even if it is a precedent, is it a bad precedent? And how should we think about it? And so I'd just be curious about your thinking about it, but what others have said in kind of commenting on this part of the book.
Yeah, it's a great question. A couple of questions. So let me just back up and say it was fascinating. It's not distant history, but because so much has happened in the cybersecurity space, it feels very distant. So I spent a lot of time going back, interviewing people about the context of when we deployed that attack. And I have to say, it completely changed my opinion about George W. Bush. The context here was really important. We were, at the time, this was around 2006, let's just start there. That was the year that I actually was working on Capitol Hill for Ted Kennedy. And I was tracking every day the number of US soldiers who were dying in these IED explosions. And we were headed towards a record body count in Iraq. We were also in Afghanistan, and it didn't look like there was any end in sight. And at that same point, we were getting tremendous pressure from the Israelis to give them our bunker buster bombs. And when I talked to people at the NSA at that time, they described it as a psyop, a psychological operation, that the pressure that we were getting from the Israelis to assist them or facilitate their bombing of Natanz was unlike anything they had experienced. They were coming by and dropping off pages and pages that actually Netanyahu would later make public. And there's even a YouTube presentation where he discloses some of these same documents, pressuring the United States, saying, Iran is going to get the bomb unless we bomb them. And Israel was pressuring us to say, Iran will get the bomb unless we do something about this. And they had made good on those threats before, so we knew to take them very seriously. And one thing I learned was that at one point, Israel was sending their fighter jets and helicopters on these test runs from Tel Aviv to Greece. And that wasn't a coincidental distance. The distance from Tel Aviv to the Acropolis was the exact same distance from Tel Aviv to the Natanz nuclear facility. So we knew that they were preparing. And George Bush famously said, and this wasn't originally reported by me, it was reported by my colleague David Sanger, get me a third option. Because every simulation that the Pentagon had done to show that if Israel bombed Natanz, we would be dragged into World War III. And there was a good chance we might lose because we were so overstretched already in the Middle East. So that third option came in the way of code, and that became Stuxnet. And it's worth just lingering for a second on Stuxnet and on the cautionary elements that you cited. So this was code that was designed very specifically to only act upon the exact configuration of centrifuges at Natanz. It was clearly designed with a couple lawyers sitting over the shoulder of these coders to make sure it did not do any destruction to any system that did not have this exact configuration of centrifuges. It was brilliant. It really was. I could spend 3 hours on Stuxnet, maybe longer. And what it did was it would search for this exact configuration. And when it found it, it would wait, I think it was 13 days to make sure it was exactly this configuration of centrifuges. And then it did something brilliant. It would speed up the centrifuges, destroying the uranium in those centrifuges for I think just a few minutes, and then it would sit back for 27 days, and then it would get back into the system, and it would slow it down for minutes, and then it would back off for 27 days. I think those were, don't quote me on the day number, but that's what it did. And then all the while, when Iran's engineers were looking at their screens, they saw sort of this Ocean's 11 Mission Impossible element that showed that everything was running smoothly. So what it did was mimic the natural accidents that happen at uranium enrichment plants, where something like 10% of centrifuges get thrown out a year from natural accidents. And that's what was happening in Iran even before Stuxnet. So this code was genius. It was careful. It was exact. And it took extra precautions to make sure the Iranians never truly understood what was happening beneath their very eyes. The problem is that it got out. We don't know how it got out, but someone screwed up and that got out. And what happened next? And here's what I'll say. That code was a bloody masterpiece. I really think of it as the Manhattan Project, the digital version of the Manhattan Project without the bombs. It kept more soldiers from coming home in caskets. The problem is that short term, it was a bloody masterpiece. Long term, I think what happened once it got out and once it was dissected by security researchers and governments, is it opened up these other countries' eyes to not just the espionage potential of a zero-day exploit, but the destructive potential of a zero-day exploit. It also set a new precedent that by the United States and Israel, that it was okay, as long as you did so with code, to reach into another country's nuclear facility and destroy things, or in this case, take out their centrifuges. So since then, we have seen a huge ramp up from other governments to acquire their own zero-day exploits, both for espionage, but in some cases for an attack on critical infrastructure. Now, you raise a really fair criticism, which is, Wouldn't this have been inevitable? And I think, yes, it would have been inevitable. Inevitably, because the world was drifting online, governments would have seen not just the espionage potential, but the impact to critical infrastructure that could be done with a cyber attack. But I think it was also fair to say this was a catalyst. Um, Anyone you talk to in government who was involved with these programs will say, we never expected Iran and North Korea to catch up in this way so quickly. We underestimated how soon they would pull off their own cyber attacks. And just one little correction there. I mean, they did not use the exact code in Stuxnet to pull off these attacks. There was another attack on Iran's oil ministry and on some of its oil facilities around the same time that wiped data on their networks. And I think that is the one that Iran ultimately picked up, retrofitted, and used on Saudi Aramco, where they didn't just, and this was 2 years after after Stuxnet was discovered, they used this wiper code to decimate the data on something like 30,000 computers at Saudi Aramco. And they didn't just decimate it, they replaced it with an image of a burning American flag. And, it was basically a big middle finger to the United States to say, see, we can do this too. They might not need to pull off a Stuxnet or get into a uranium centrifuge, but they could do a lot of harm with this wiper code. The other thing I would say is, yes, these programs were inevitable, but what I learned in the book is that we Americans helped speed up some of these programs and sharing our own tradecraft, both by selling zero-day exploits and trainings to governments like Turkey that are technically our allies, but you don't have to be an ignoramus to know how Erdogan planned on using some of those zero-day exploits and spyware. All you had to do was look at what his thugs were doing outside the ambassador's residence a couple of years ago. And I learned even more directly, we being US contractors, were poaching NSA hackers from the agency, promising them to double, quadruple their salaries and send them overseas to places like Abu Dhabi. Originally, we told them that they would be doing just the same work they were doing at the NSA, tracking terror cells. But inevitably, within a couple of months, the assignment changed, and their clients in Abu Dhabi said, thank you for tracking ISIS for the last few months. We'd like you to now hack Qatar. And so I write in the book about this one incident that an employee, a former NSA hacker, told me about, which is they asked him to get into the emails of the Qatari royals, and they wanted to know what their flight itineraries were, who they were meeting with, what they were saying. And so they got into their emails. Now, Qatar is an American ally. So that on its face is a little bizarre. But what really kind of slapped me across the face was when this former NSA hacker told me that at one point, Michelle Obama, who was then the First Lady of the United States, she was still in office, 2014, 2015, was going to visit Qatar and was trading personal notes, security details, flight itineraries with the Sheikha, the Emir's wife in Qatar. And all of those communications from the First Lady of the United States were flowing back to a former NSA hacker's computer working for the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. That to me just symbolized how out of control and lawless this market has become, which gets me to your second question around norms. Nobody in this business wants norms. They make some really legitimate arguments, which is we're just sharing tradecraft and code. We're just sharing information. Inevitably, our adversaries and more dubious allies are going to learn to code themselves. So we're not doing anything wrong here. And if you impede the flow of this information, the argument goes, you could really impact defense because zero-day exploits can be used, like I said, for penetration testing, for testing networks, for seeing how vulnerable some of these critical infrastructure systems are. So if you impede the flow of this information, you will be handicapping defense. I would retort that I don't think that the situation is that black and white. I give people more credit in thinking that we could probably come up with some basic rules of behavior, like not sending our own taxpayer-funded NSA hackers overseas to train other governments to do some of the spycraft, particularly when it comes to countries we know have poor human rights records. And then in terms of, international norms when it comes to cyber warfare, I say in the book, this is tricky because on its face, it sounds like a no-brainer that we would establish a digital Geneva Convention and that we would all agree to not hack each other's hospitals, elections, nuclear plants, power grids, etc. The problem is in the fine print. Here in the United States, the people who pull off these attacks are at the Pentagon Cyber Command and the espionage equivalent at the NSA. In Russia, we know that there is a very healthy or unhealthy relationship between the state and its cyber criminals. We know this from the Yahoo attack a couple of years ago, when they were able to ultimately pin that attack on 4 people, 2 of whom were Russian cyber criminals who mined people's Yahoo data and sold it on the black market. But the FSB the other 2 were members of the FSB who said, when you find an account for a staffer at the White House, for instance, you hand that over to us. And in China, I've been covering Chinese cyber attacks for 10 years now. The most sophisticated attacks these days don't come from the PLA anymore. They don't even come out of the Ministry of State Security. They come from the satellite of contractors and moonlighters who operate on its behalf. They'll go tap the guy at Tencent, who's their best security engineer or hacker, on the shoulder and say, tonight you're coming with us. And in Iran, we know from in these indictments that it's really the contractors and these private companies in Iran who are doing some of the most sophisticated attacks on behalf of the state. So these countries enjoy a degree of plausible deniability that we don't have here in the United States, or even in countries like Israel, where they have designated cyber forces. And so let's say we did agree to not hack Russia's grid and Russia agreed to not hack our grid. Okay, so we don't do that, but what's to say Russia wouldn't just outsource those attacks to cyber criminals? And we all saw Putin a couple of years ago when he said, hackers are like artists, they wake up in the morning and they just start painting. And, the implication was, I have nothing to do with them. And we know that that is a lie. So it becomes very difficult to even think about agreeing to any kind of norm that we know these other nation states, and particularly our adversaries, would never agree to. Also, as I said, we are still the most sophisticated actor in cyberspace. No one has ever pulled off anything as sophisticated as Stuxnet. Maybe we have again, and none of us know about it. But we don't want to handcuff ourselves because we preserve this advantage. But the problem is our advantage is closing as these other countries have developed their own cyber brigades. And they might not have closed all the way completely just yet, but over the next decade or 2, there's a good chance that they'll come very close, if not be on par with what we're able to do here. And they've learned that they'll never be able to match us on the battlefield in kinetic warfare. And so a lot of them are pouring most of their resources into their cyber capabilities.
I want to encourage people to start putting questions up. I've got one more that plays off something you just said. I mean, you talk about how Chinese have, basically contractors or folks that aren't now part of the ministry but are doing this, and the Russians use criminal networks. But you were earlier describing a U.S. company that is a private company doing the work for the UAE and Qatar. So, in a sense, kind of what's the difference in terms of a state making sure, regulating, doing everything it can to make sure that its citizens and businesses aren't engaged in this kind of activity? If you look at it that way, it may be a wider problem where it's not clear who the good guys and the bad guys are. I want to play on the moral hazard issue because you talk about in the book that what the NSA at first and then others who are buying vulnerabilities and are doing could be a moral hazard because it's leaving consumers more vulnerable to this. And then at the end of the book, I think very importantly, you get to another moral hazard, and it's one that Bruce Schneier wrote about in the New York Times this morning, and I thought in a very powerful way that people should look at, which is to say that American businesses, starting with Microsoft and others, have gotten rich not worrying about security, but basically socializing on to the users and taxpayers the flaws in their security. So the system that we have here creates a moral hazard where the designer and the seller says, well, if something bad happens, not my problem, I got paid. It's the user's problem or it's the government's problem. Mm-hmm. And so I would argue there's a tremendous moral hazard here. That's the way our economy works, which the government has allowed. But it isn't the NSA as much as it's the companies who don't pay attention to making their stuff safe in the first place. And so when one talks to hackers, they get indignant. Some of them are mad at you, but they say, look, these guys make crappy stuff. And so we go out and find it, and then they get mad at us. But they're the ones that are producing lousy products. We're the ones that are actually trying to, demonstrate what would have to be done to clean it up. And so I guess one of the questions is, in all your thinking about this and your reporting on it, are there ways to think about standards, regulations, other that could require producers of the technology to actually invest more time and effort in making their products more secure, rather than passing off, in a sense, the expense to the rest of us?
Yeah, and I address this in the book, and I think I probably just as hard on the industry's approach to this, especially in the early days when Microsoft was just churning out shoddy code all the time, as I am critical of the NSA and some of these other countries. So, the quote I use in the book is actually from Lonesome Dove, and it's, I think we spent our best years fighting on the wrong side. And I think that's right. People have this misconception of hackers. Hackers are not cyber criminals in a lot of cases. They are just tinkerers who find these vulnerabilities in code. And for a long time, they were calling up or trying to call Microsoft and Sun back in the day and HP and saying, hey, I just found this giant problem in your coding and I can use it to get into NASA systems. You should fix this. And the response back then being in the 90s, when Microsoft especially had been caught flat-footed when it came to the internet and was losing to Netscape and others, and was just churning out web servers and software that was just riddled with vulnerabilities. The response from Microsoft and those companies in the days was stop poking around our software or we'll sue you. And so hackers, took to these forums and basically just started publishing these vulnerabilities, sometimes just to thumb their nose at the company, sometimes in hopes it would pressure these systems administrators and engineers to actually fix them, sometimes just for the street cred. And it took a long time. It took some serious attacks using Microsoft software at the turn of the century before government officials started calling up Bill Gates and saying, fix your security or we will take our business elsewhere. And that became Bill Gates's open, trustworthy computing initiative memo, in which he said, security is going to be one of our top priorities here at Microsoft, and it'll be critical to the future of the internet. And they did actually rearrange and redesign their systems to put security in place far earlier than after the code had already made its way into all these systems. But they rearranged their organization to essentially look at the security of this code before it made its way out the door. They set up channels to take these phone calls from hackers when they did have a problem with their code and to fix them. And they did come a long way very quickly. They are not perfect. Most of the most sophisticated attacks we continue to see exploit Microsoft Windows. And so there's still a long way to go. And like I said, I actually put a lot of the blame on Facebook simply because Mark Zuckerberg's philosophy in his IPO S1 was literally move fast and break things. Fortunately, I stopped by Facebook a few years ago and someone had graffitied on the wall of their headquarters, move slowly and fix your at SHIT. So the philosophy is changing a little bit. But the companies are very, very guilty here in turning out vulnerable code. And I think you're right that there is a huge incentive problem there, because really it's just get your product to market first and you'll win out. Fix all the problems later. That's move fast and break things. So we need to change the incentive structures. Now, the person who I thought had the best idea on this is Gary Bra, who wrote the book Securing Software, Secure Software. His idea is, if we're not going to agree as a country to exact penalties on companies for putting out vulnerable code, which I actually don't think is a bad idea, but there's no chance of that passing in Congress, because every time we've tried to just put out a bill that says, here's our critical infrastructure, here's the way to secure it. If you don't do it, there will be consequences. Every time we've tried to do that, lobbyists, particularly at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, have watered it down and said this is too onerous for businesses. And by the way, 80% of the critical infrastructure in the United States is run by private companies, not just PG&Es, but small municipal, water treatment facilities owned by mom and pops. And so the lobbying argument goes that it would be too onerous on businesses to exact any kind of regulation when it comes to securing these systems. So Gary's idea is, okay, if we're not going to put any sticks on this, let's create some carrots in the form of tax incentives for companies that agree to serious penetration tests, not just the compliance checklists that Deloitte and Price Waterhouse, et cetera, do, but serious penetration tests. If they are found to be using regular patched, updated software, if they're not using old Microsoft XP software that's no longer supported, if they have two-factor authentication turned on, if they have strong authentication and encryption, then we should reward those companies with tax credits. And I actually think that's a good idea here in the United States, where we clearly can't get to a place where we can agree that we should mandate some of the things that other countries in Japan and Scandinavia do. So that's one idea. But I also am not above saying we need to start punishing companies that roll out shoddy code. And, just look at SolarWinds. I mean, after we discovered that SolarWinds was used as a conduit for this attack, look where their software was. The Department of Energy, the Nuclear Lab, Cyber Command, the Pentagon, the State Department, the Justice Department, Treasury, Commerce, the utilities. There is no more sensitive target. And their software had wide access to these systems. And what was the password to get into their software update mechanism? It was SolarWinds 123. They had no way of communicating with hackers to learn if they had any vulnerabilities in their code. The person who worked inside SolarWinds in security told me that he made several presentations to executives saying your security is shoddy, and if you don't make a greater internal commitment to it, this could be catastrophic. And they didn't do anything, and he left. So, in my mind, SolarWinds is really, first of all, I don't think that we should expect every company out there to defend against a sophisticated Russian intelligence unit. I think that is a little absurd. But we need to raise the bar significantly. And if we just met these basic security protocols, we would wipe out something like 75% of the threats we face. But we're not even doing that. And so at the end of the book, in the epilogue, and one of the criticisms of the book is that I didn't dwell enough on policy and I focused too much on the technology. But in my mind, there's no point in debating these having these higher up policy discussions if we can't do the most basic things to lock down the code. And so, that I think in this situation, we really just have to start with baby steps, and otherwise there's no point in having some of these other conversations.
It's really, I mean, as I think about it and listening to you and thinking about the book, I mean, in some ways it's a not an encyclopedia, but it's kind of a map of our dysfunction. I mean, you've got the wrong incentives on the production side, and so you got all these vulnerabilities, and then you've got the kind of inadequate consideration of other values in the government side in deciding what to do with these things. You've got a totally dysfunctional Congress. You've got campaign finance reform that kind of reinforces how dysfunctional Congress is, because they're getting paid this way. They don't, and you kind of look at it and you say, well, no wonder we've got this mess. There are a couple questions I want to try to pick up. One is in the thinking about the core of the book, or at least the earliest part of the book, and the government's decision about buying vulnerabilities, but also in when and how to notify the companies, hey, you have a vulnerability, so they can patch it, as opposed to keeping it. So there's the vulnerabilities equity process. The question is, in that government decision making, is there adequate representation of interests that would be on the defender side, on the side of let's protect the consumer and patch, rather than let's exploit this for intelligence or war fighting?
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by the VEP process. This is the first time we're talking about it. But yes, there is this formal process that was started under the George W. Bush administration, whereby they would pull in representatives from some of the government agencies and debate whether to turn over or keep some of these vulnerabilities. And I really credit the United States for this because, yes, the US does this. So does, I believe, the UK, Canada, and Australia, and probably New Zealand. Government officials in Iran are not sitting around a mahogany table at the White House debating whether to turn over vulnerability to Microsoft or not. So, we deserve credit for having those formalized discussions. But as I say in the book, the person who really leads those discussions, beyond the White House cybersecurity coordinator, a position that was eliminated under Trump, is the person who leads information assurance at the NSA, which is the defensive side of the house. And the Department of Homeland Security is represented, and they are in charge of keeping us safe. There are others, I believe, from, I'm blanking right now, but maybe Commerce and Treasury. But no, I mean, one of the things I say in the epilogue is I do think we need more civilian representation, because a lot of the attacks we face today are not on government. It's on ransomware attacks on hospitals. It's the attacks, on transportation systems, and at schools. So why not have some of the people who have to run point on the policies related to some of those attacks represented in those discussions? Why not bring in the Department of Health and Human Services? Because right now our hospitals are getting ransomwared every other week. So if we find a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows and we are deciding to keep it, but that same vulnerability could be used to wipe out patient records at hospitals, why shouldn't the Department of Health and Human Services have a stake in those discussions? And I think the point that intelligence officials and the information security community would make there is, well, they don't know anything about cybersecurity. Well, I don't think that's true anymore. I think they know enough to know how these tools get used. I just covered an attack a couple of months ago on a hospital in Vermont, and most of these ransomware attacks, they just wipe out patient records. And we think, well, doctors can still see patients, no big deal. They'll remediate their insurance policy will get them back up to speed. No, it turns out that in that attack, it wiped out the chemotherapy protocols for chemo patients. So chemo patients were showing up to their treatments and there was no record of what they had been given. And these are pretty complicated protocols. And so nurses were left trying to figure out what to give them by memory. And one nurse she said, the only thing I can compare what was happening here on the ground to is when I worked in the burn unit after the Boston Marathon bombing. No one realizes how serious and hard this is for us. So these attacks are getting closer and closer to the point where we can feel them. And, the stakes are getting higher, not just for government, but for all of us. And so, yes, I do think there should be better representation in the VEP process. What was the second part of the question, George? Sorry.
No, I think that was
Okay.
it. That was helpful. Then a question. You talked about Argentina as a place where the hacker community has grown. Are there other kind of pockets or places where there's a large community like that that's part of this marketplace?
Well, one of the interesting things is, and this is maybe in the pro category for continuing to fuel this market, is a couple of years ago, let's say 2015, 2016, when I would go to these international hacking conferences in Vancouver, there's a big one called Pwn to Own, where they have these competitions and everyone tries to get into the same technology, like your MacBook Air, Chrome browser, for instance, in the shortest amount of time. And if you break it, you get whatever you broke into, or maybe I think the last prize was a Tesla. So I went to these hacking conferences, and always the years I went, Chinese hackers were the one dominating these competitions. China and South Korea. And in recent years, they're not dominating those competitions, not because they would anyway, but because they're not allowed to go anymore. The Chinese state has recognized the power of a 0 day, and particularly the power of a 0 day to spy on its own people. And so they basically put out a new policy that you're not allowed to share this information at hacking conferences or overseas or for defense, because they see the inherent value for surveillance and espionage. So they're keeping those capabilities and tradecraft and skills in-house. And you don't have to wonder how they're getting used, because a couple of years ago, I think maybe late 2019, uh, Google and a couple other security firms discovered a Uyghur website with information about Uyghurs that was running code that if you visited the website, it could get into your iPhone or Android and spy on you in real time using some really sophisticated 0 day exploits that would have cost, something like tens of millions of dollars on the black market, Google said at the time. And when I talked to people like Jim Lewis at CSIS, he said, China sees its biggest threat as the five poisons, Uyghurs, Tibetans, et cetera. And so they will always use these tools on their own people first before they turn them back on us. But this is where the capabilities are going. So, in China, you could argue that maybe they don't even have a market. They're just tapping people on the shoulder. And that actually gets to a really significant problem here we haven't even talked about, which is a skills shortage here in the United States. These days, people with the capabilities to find a 0 day exploit and exploit it, really, programmers, hackers, they have a lot of lucrative opportunities outside government these days. They can go work for Microsoft or Amazon or FireEye or Google, and they can get paid a lot more than they would in government. And they can get all the fun perks that you get and less of the red tape. And even those who do decide to go into government, often the best want to go work at the NSA, or these days maybe Cyber Command. They don't want to go work at the Department of Homeland Security on the defensive side of the house. And when they do go work at DHS, they only last a few years because they can't handle the red tape, and because, frankly, offense has always been more fun than defense. And we conduct all our own cyber attacks in-house, but in China and Russia, like we talked about, they can go tap the guy at Tencent on the shoulder and say, tonight you're coming with us. We don't do that to the guy at Google. So we are facing a bit of a skills shortage now. And when you look at these annual collegiate programming contests, the big winners years ago used to be Carnegie Mellon, Princeton, Stanford, Cal State, Harvard, MIT. That's not the case anymore. The kids who win these competitions are in Eastern Europe, they're in Russia, they're in China. So it's not looking good for our outlook in terms of being able to recruit the people in the same way that China and others can script these people. And so that's a whole other, problem we're going to have to deal with.
Just thinking of talent, and there was a question that was also asked. Is there, are there trends about women's participation in this field? You may have an anecdotal impression, but I don't know if there are studies. I haven't read them.
I haven't read any studies either. But, two of the heroes in my book are heroines. Heather Adkins at Google, who leads their information security and was one of the first responders to the Chinese attack on their systems back in 2009, 2010. She's a legend. Every time I think about her, I just want to stand up and applaud. And then the other is Katie Masouras, who is at Microsoft, who helped spearhead their bug bounty programs and now runs her own company, Luta Security. And more you see women in this space. But, I also don't want to skip over the fact that there's been some really incredible women like Wendy Nather, who works at DuoSec, and others who are just incredible in this field. Like I said, Ann Neuberger, is going to have a big leadership role here. And, I am hard on the NSA as being a catalyst for some of these exploitation programs, but just in the last couple of years under Ann's leadership on the defensive side of the house, the NSA, the agency we used to call no such agency, has slowly started putting out information about technology that's being exploited by Russia or China. And it was always a little bit late. It wasn't that actionable when you talk to security researchers and industry experts, but it was a big step culturally for the NSA to talk about anything they were seeing in terms of what the adversaries were doing and the technology they were exploiting. So it was a big step forward. And so it's a good sign that she's been tapped into this position, because I think we'll see more of that.
Great, thanks. A big question, and it gets at the moral hazard issue in a way, and it's asked, why aren't coders and software companies liable for defects just like automakers are? And this whole issue of liability when it comes to ICT is really interesting. Have you thought about it or encountered that debate, and what do you hear?
I have not gone deep on that debate, but think about the auto industry. We force the companies to bear the cost of these recalls when we do find shoddy, things. And in software, some of it's just not supported or patched anymore, like Windows XP. Some of it they just say, okay, here's your update, and they can just roll it out. But yeah, there's no penalty to them for putting this code out there. I mean, the information security community is hypercritical. They're hypercritical of me, particularly on Twitter. But what my predecessor at the time, John Markoff, said to me when I first started on this job was, the reason I don't want to cover this anymore is because if we could sue the security industry for malpractice, they would be bankrupt. And I feel like that is true. And I also feel like that should be true for some of the technology manufacturers. If you could sue them for vulnerabilities in their code, then a lot of them would be out of business. And so I do think it's worthy of having that discussion. Maybe, why can't we sue SolarWinds for having SolarWinds 123 as their password for their software update mechanism? Why should they get off scot-free in this? And I don't think that's a completely fair thing to say, because ultimately we're probably talking about Russia's SVR intelligence agency, and they could probably get into anything they want. But clearly their security was shoddy. And what do we do with that? Because the cost of that, could range in the billions of dollars once we get every last Russian backdoor out of our system.
Well, and the idea that you either have zero liability or all liability seems, it's a nice metaphor, binary 1 and 0, but there might be someplace in between. The last question I've got is about open source software and kind of how to improve the security of that, and how open source kind of is a factor in the work that you've been covering.
It's such a good question. So, when I called, I'll just start with SolarWinds again. Sorry, SolarWinds. But, when I called around to the victims of the SolarWinds attack, most of them didn't even know they were using SolarWinds software, let alone that most of SolarWinds software is built and tested in places like Belarus. Not to say that Belarus is, a dangerous place, but just to say that we don't know where our code is being built. And we definitely don't know where the tools that make up our tools are built. And that was never more clear than a few years ago, when researchers all over the world discovered the vulnerability in a piece of open source code called OpenSSL that they called Heartbleed. OpenSSL just was a piece of a security protocol that was used for encryption and safeguarding systems. And it was used by everyone from Amazon to the Pentagon and the FBI. And they found this gaping hole in it that could be allowed to, exploited by hackers to basically steal data and read encrypted the data in plain text. And when we dug in, I learned that OpenSSL, this protocol, this open source protocol that made its way into some of the biggest technology products out there and into our own government systems was being secured and updated by two guys named Steve living in the UK who were living off of volunteer donations of $3,000 a year and could barely pay their energy bills. So clearly, there's a problem there. So the person who's really been thinking most deeply about this is Jim Zemlin at the Linux Foundation. And I think he has some really terrific ideas that I outline in the epilogue of the book, which are we need to be, and they are doing this, they're engaged in this census effort to identify what is the most critical open source, what are the most critical open source tools we use. Let's identify them and let's make sure that they have enough funding. Let's make sure that the people who are updating and maintaining this code feel supported. And let's also vet those people as well, because as long as this code is making its way into our autonomous vehicles and our power grid and the Pentagon and Amazon Web Services, then we need to know that the people updating this code are good people. So he's advocated for something like a driver's license or a passport for these coders, to know that they've not only been through trainings, but that we can vouch for them and make sure that they're not planting backdoors in some of these open source protocols, which is something that we have seen. But it's a really tricky problem, and the philosophy around open source has always been, and I'm blanking on his name now, sort of father of open source, but that like Wikipedia, that with enough eyeballs, this would be much more secure than the closed proprietary code at Apple and Microsoft, et cetera, because we would all have the ability to vet what's in that code theoretically. But as OpenSSL and the Heartbleed vulnerability demonstrated, is there weren't any eyeballs. There were two pairs of eyeballs, and so it's a really big problem. And at a higher up level, SolarWinds, people didn't know it was in their system. They didn't know where it was built and maintained. They had no idea about the security of the software, and we only learned about it after the fact. I think that there are a lot more demons we're going to find if we dig into open source code. So yeah, it's definitely a huge problem, and I think the Linux Foundation has some great papers I would recommend people read up on the security of open source.
Great. Well, it's later than the early morning when we started. You've done great. We've gotten a lot out of this, and like I say, it's a book that's packed with insight and is quite a pleasure to read. I want to join everybody. If we were at Carnegie in person, there would be loud applause, but this is virtual. So I will send on behalf of everybody who's, virtual applause to you, Nicole, and wish you all the best. And thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, George. And I know it's not as fun virtually, but I did get to talk to George yesterday and hear his daughter in the background. And I think I'm going to miss these glimpses into each other's home lives. So hopefully we'll get drinks in DC one of these days soon. But thank you so much for hosting this.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
You too.